What if everything you think you know about ancient spiritual authority is wrong? What if behind the solemn rituals, the sacred vestments, and the incense drifting through the temple courts, there existed a shadowed system designed to break anyone who dared question the spiritual order? Imagine standing in a dim stone chamber beneath the holy precincts, where torches flicker against walls that have heard confessions no scripture dared record. Now ask yourself this: what happens when the most powerful religious figures of an ancient society decide that a dissident does not simply need correction, but erasure? That question haunted even the advisors who served those high priests, men trained to witness severity, yet stunned by what unfolded in those hidden chambers. This is not a tale of myth or exaggeration. It is a glimpse into the undercurrent of fear that shaped the fate of those who challenged priestly authority in the ancient Hebrew world. Beneath the ceremonial purity laws and sanctified rituals lay an unspoken truth. Spiritual dissent wasn't merely disagreement. It was treason against the divine order. And when a dissident stood before the high priest, there was no neutral ground, no possibility of walking away unchanged. Advisors whispered of rituals so severe that even they questioned whether the punishment matched the supposed transgression. Yet the system persisted because it was crafted to preserve not only doctrine, but power. Picture this same dissident being led through a narrow inner passageway, past veiled curtains embroidered with symbols of holiness. The deeper he goes, the more oppressive the silence becomes, as if the walls themselves are waiting. The high priest appears not as a gentle shepherd of souls, but as the guardian of a sacred structure that cannot tolerate dissonance. His advisors stand behind him, stiff, uneasy, aware that what is about to happen is not part of any public liturgy. The dissident's fate is sealed not by scripture, but by fear, legacy, and the weight of tradition interpreted as absolute authority. And here is where the story grows darker. For some high priests, enforcing orthodoxy meant pushing rituals into territories never intended for human endurance. Methods meant to purify became instruments of psychological fracture. Sacred texts were recited not to uplift, but to intimidate. Silence became a weapon. Shadows became accomplices. Advisors, the very men expected to uphold these acts, later confessed they were horrified by what they had witnessed, saying nothing only because they valued their lives more than their conscience. And still, the dissident remained alone, trapped between divine accusation and human cruelty. You may be thinking, how far could these priests really go? What secrets were they hiding behind those layers of ritual purity? Hold on to that question. It will matter more than you can imagine as we peel back the layers of history and expose what was never meant to be remembered. What you are about to uncover may challenge your understanding of ancient holiness forever. Before we continue, tell me something. What do you think about the idea of sacred power being used as a tool of fear rather than faith? Leave your thoughts below. And if this opening has already stirred something in you, make sure to like the video and check whether you're subscribed so you don't miss the revelations ahead. The truths hidden in the next part will shift the way you see ancient authority, and the path we're stepping onto only grows darker from here. The deeper you go into the structure of ancient Hebrew priesthood, the clearer it becomes that dissent was never merely a theological inconvenience. It was a direct threat to an intricate hierarchy that had been refined over generations, where every role, every lineage, every privilege existed inside a fragile balance of sacred duty and political control. The high priest did not stand alone. He was the apex of a pyramid that included Temple guards, ritual experts, purification overseers, prophetic interpreters, royal liaisons, and above them all, the silent pressure of ancestral expectations. Each member of this hierarchy knew their place, and more importantly, understood the danger of stepping outside it. To be born into the priestly lineage meant inheriting not only the rituals, but the weight of tradition built like stone upon your shoulders. Younger priests trained under the watchful eyes of elders who believed that order, strict, unquestionable order, was the very lifeblood of the nation. Any deviation could invite chaos. Any new interpretation could fracture unity. Within such a tightly woven system, even a whisper of alternative belief could echo like a threat. The dissident, long before he reached the hidden chambers of judgment, had already disrupted the invisible currents that held the hierarchy together. And this hierarchy, though sanctified by scripture and ritual, behaved like any powerful institution when threatened. It closed ranks. A dissident was never confronted by a single man. He was confronted by centuries of inherited authority. Behind the high priest stood members of the Sanhedrin, each carrying the burden of guarding tradition. Behind them stood the Levites, custodians of the sacred spaces. Behind them, the scribes whose ink preserved every decree. And behind all of them, unseen yet deeply felt, stood the memory of past uprisings, past heresies, past moments where disorder nearly devoured the community. This fear was the fuel that fed the system. Inside this atmosphere, tensions brewed constantly beneath the surface. Different priestly families competed for influence. Some emphasized rigid purity laws. Others clung to older traditions, and still others sought ways to adapt to changing times. Yet all these factions, divided as they were, shared one unshakable belief. Dissidents could not be allowed to fracture the sacred order. Their presence forced the key hierarchy into a state of defensive unity, even when they privately disagreed with one another. It was a silent agreement, an unspoken understanding that preserving the structure mattered more than questioning its consequences. This is why the dissident, even before facing any ritual examination, was already condemned by the very environment in which he stood. Advisors whispered among themselves, scribes documented everything with deliberate vagueness, and temple guards remained expressionless, even when their eyes betrayed unease. They all sensed the gravity of what was unfolding, because once a person was labeled a spiritual threat, the machinery of the hierarchy moved with unstoppable momentum. The process was less about determining guilt and more about reaffirming control. Imagine walking into a chamber surrounded by men who had built their entire lives on the belief that your words could unravel the sacred fabric of their world. Imagine facing a hierarchy that saw your conviction not as bravery, but as contamination, something that could spread if not contained immediately. In such a system, compassion became dangerous, hesitation became suspicious, and silence became safer than truth. Every look, every gesture, every breath in that room carried the weight of centuries of doctrine pressing down on a single individual. And as the dissident stood before them, the hierarchy watched with a cold resolve shaped by countless generations. The high priest's gaze reflected not personal anger, but the expectation of all who came before him. The advisors shifted uncomfortably, already sensing that the next ritual phase would reveal just how far the guardians of tradition were willing to go to protect their sacred order. The path ahead was about to lead the dissident into rituals darker and more psychologically crushing than anything the public ever imagined. And the hierarchy, ancient, rigid, and deeply afraid, was prepared to let the process unfold exactly as it always had. The first stage of dealing with a spiritual dissident was never outwardly violent. The high priests understood that breaking a person began with unsettling their spirit long before any physical ritual took place. Everything started with selection, quiet, deliberate, and always done away from public eyes. The accused seldom knew when the moment of isolation would come. It might be during a routine temple visit, a simple dispute with a scribe, or even after offering an interpretation of a sacred verse that deviated too far from accepted tradition. One misstep, and suddenly the walls of the temple no longer felt like a place of refuge, but a labyrinth designed to swallow the unwanted. Temple guards approached without haste, their footsteps echoing in a way that made the dissident's heartbeat feel louder than the sandals scraping the stone floor. They did not accuse. They did not explain. They merely escorted, allowing the silence itself to shape fear. The deeper they walked, the darker the corridors became. Soft chanting from distant chambers faded away, replaced by an oppressive quiet that pressed against the mind. The dissident could feel the hierarchy closing in, though no one had spoken a word. Isolation was not simply physical. It was spiritual, psychological, and meticulously engineered. Once inside the first chamber, the dissident faced the initial test, one designed not to judge truth, but to destabilize certainty. Ritual purity questions were posed in rapid succession, phrased in ways that twisted familiar teachings into unfamiliar angles. Priestly examiners watched closely, noting every hesitation, every change in breath, every flicker of doubt across the dissident's eyes. The purpose was simple: to make the dissident question whether he truly understood the laws he believed he was defending. It was a subtle but powerful tactic, eroding confidence until the mind began to fracture under its own uncertainty. Then came the symbolic trials. Sacred objects were placed before the dissident: scroll fragments, consecrated vessels, ritual tools, each with a specific symbolic weight. The dissident was ordered to describe their meaning, their purpose, their spiritual implications. But unknown to him, the examiners had intentionally rearranged the objects, altered their sequence, or presented them outside proper context. A correct answer delivered at the wrong moment could be twisted into evidence of defiance. A hesitation could be interpreted as spiritual instability. Even a perfectly accurate explanation might be dismissed as arrogance. It was a trial no one could pass, because passing was never part of the design. As the dissident struggled through the tests, the room's atmosphere shifted in barely perceptible ways. Lamps were dimmed to disorient sight. Incense was burned in stronger doses, not for sanctity, but to cloud the senses. The rhythm of the examiner's voices grew slower, more monotonous, creating a hypnotic pull that made the dissident feel untethered from time. Advisors stood in the background, arms folded, exchanging uneasy glances as the dissident's resolve began to erode. Even they, accustomed to witnessing severity, could not ignore the growing tension in the air. Hours passed without acknowledgement. There was no break, no water, no moment to breathe. The dissident was left alone with his thoughts, while examiners muttered among themselves just loud enough for him to hear fragments. Fragments, intentionally ambiguous, meant to seed fear. Words like contamination, danger, and corruption drifted through the air like smoke. The dissident could no longer tell whether he was defending the truth or being swallowed by a ritual designed to make him forget it. And when the final question came, a question framed with such complexity that no mortal could possibly answer, it did not matter what response he gave. The examiners exchanged slow, solemn nods, signaling that the dissident had failed the test. He was never meant to survive. The guard stepped forward once more, not with aggression, but with cold efficiency. The first phase was over. The dissident had been chosen, isolated, and spiritually unmoored. What awaited him next would push the boundaries of ritual into far darker territory, where the judgments were no longer tests of belief, but instruments of psychological domination disguised as sacred duty. The clandestine judgment that awaited a dissident in the hands of the high priests was nothing like a public trial. There were no witnesses, no scrolls of record, no external authority to observe what unfolded. Inside the hidden chambers of the temple, time itself seemed to bend under the weight of anticipation. The walls, thick with centuries of ritual, absorbed every whispered command and every shiver of fear. Here, decisions were enforced not with open violence, but with psychological precision, a form of control so absolute that even the most defiant minds often succumbed. The process began with isolation. Dissidents were led through a labyrinth of stone corridors, each turn designed to disorient and intimidate. Candles flickered, casting shadows that moved like specters across the walls. The air was heavy with incense, its aroma no longer sacred but oppressive, clouding thought and sense. Advisors and scribes observed from behind screens, cataloging reactions, noting hesitation, every twitch of the eye, every falter in speech. Their task was not mercy, it was documentation, a record of every indication that the dissident could be broken, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Then came the ceremonies of questioning. Sacred symbols were presented in distorted order, scrolls were recited in altered phrasing, and ritual objects were touched in ways that undermined their known purpose. The dissident, trained in the teachings of the priests, found familiar rites transformed into instruments of confusion. Every response, no matter how precise, could be reframed as defiance. Every pause, every faltered breath, became evidence of spiritual corruption. The high priests were meticulous. They did not merely seek confession, they sought submission of the mind itself, a surrender that was invisible to the outside world, yet total in its impact. Psychological strategies intensified. The dissident was deprived of natural rhythms, sleep, food, and human contact, forcing the mind to drift into a state where reality blurred with interpretation. Advisors whispered behind hidden partitions, offering veiled comments meant to sow doubt, fear, and despair. Ritual chants filled the chambers at irregular intervals, some soothing, some jarring, creating a tension that made clarity impossible. The dissident began to question his own understanding, wondering if the doctrine he had believed pure was in fact flawed, corrupted, dangerous. This was no longer a trial of action. It was a trial of identity, a subtle dismantling of self. And then, the punishments became symbolic. Certain chambers contained instruments of restraint, not for pain, but for reflection. Dissidents were left in solitude with sacred relics they were forbidden to touch correctly, forced to meditate on teachings while knowing that every misstep would be recorded. The high priests watched for signs of breakdown, trembling hands, broken phrases, a faltering voice. Each signal was noted, each hesitation catalogued, because these were the metrics of obedience, or the seeds of further discipline. Stories from advisors reveal moments that even they found shocking. One elder recalled seeing a dissident kneel before a ceremonial vessel, attempting the rites exactly as instructed, only to be subtly misled into performing the wrong gesture, producing both shame and fear. Another spoke of the silence that followed, broken only by the faint, eerie hum of the high priest's chant, an unrelenting pressure that felt alive. No physical lash was needed. The mind itself became the instrument of torment. Even those who entered with unwavering faith left altered, fractured, unsure of what they truly believed. It was here, at the peak of these clandestine proceedings, that the high priests demonstrated the ultimate lesson. Control is absolute when it can bend the spirit without leaving visible marks. Advisors who witnessed these sessions admitted they were haunted for years, often unable to reconcile their reverence for ritual with the undeniable severity of the methods employed. And yet, even as fear and uncertainty filled the dissident's mind, a faint, unspoken hope lingered, one that would carry the story forward. Now, I want to hear from you. What would you have done if placed in that chamber? Could you maintain your faith, your beliefs, your identity? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or feelings. The darkness of these ancient rituals is not just history. It's a mirror reflecting the lengths humans will go to enforce authority. And remember, the journey is far from over. The next revelations will reveal punishments so secret, so meticulously hidden, that even their closest advisors were left speechless. Once the initial psychological and ritual trials were complete, the dissident often entered what the high priests referred to as the chamber of correction. This was not a place of physical torment in the conventional sense. It was designed to engage the spirit and body simultaneously, a space where ritual, isolation, and sensory manipulation converged to force introspection and obedience. The walls were lined with sacred texts, some illuminated with gold leaf, others intentionally obscured by shadows, their meaning partially hidden. Every object, every inscription, was calculated to evoke both awe and fear, to make the dissident feel the weight of history pressing down on a single human soul. In this chamber, fasting and silence were the first instruments of discipline. Days could pass without nourishment, the body slowly, weakening while the mind strained to remain alert. Water was provided sparingly, often infused with herbs that produced mild disorientation or drowsiness. Candles flickered erratically, sometimes extinguished for hours, leaving the dissident in near total darkness. These techniques were not meant to kill, but to strip away certainty, leaving only the raw awareness of one's isolation and the omnipotent presence of the high priests. Advisors documented each response, noting signs of mental resilience or cracks in composure. Even minor gestures, hesitation, trembling, an unguarded glance, could determine the next sequence of ritual correction. The rituals themselves were layered with symbolism and subtle cruelty. The dissident might be required to recite sacred passages in a specific order, perform gestures that mimicked purification rites, or carry ritual implements in precise ways while under intense observation. Failure was not measured by error alone, it was judged by the emotional response, fear, confusion, or defiance elicited by the tests. The high priests understood that breaking someone's mind was far more effective than punishing the body. Each misstep offered an opportunity for a deeper, more insidious form of discipline, one that left no visible mark yet embedded trauma into the very core of the dissident's psyche. In certain cases, symbolic isolation was paired with subtle sensory manipulation. Whispered chants echoed through hidden channels, creating a sense of unseen presence. The air itself seemed alive, carrying scents intended to evoke both reverence and unease. Shadows danced unnaturally across the walls, as if mocking the dissidents' attempts at composure. Advisors, trained to monitor without intervening, kept meticulous records of every tremor, every stutter, every flicker of the eyes. These notes later informed adjustments to future rituals, ensuring that the system became increasingly effective over generations. The dissident was never left to question whether these methods were arbitrary. They appeared divine, absolute, and unavoidable. The more extreme applications of the chamber involved ritual reenactments that mirrored divine judgment. Dissidents might be compelled to participate in ceremonies where the consequences of defiance were dramatized symbolically. Certain objects, previously seen as benign, were now instruments of spiritual reflection and psychological pressure. Even minor deviations from ritual correctness produced immediate corrective measures. Long periods of contemplation, additional fasting, or intensified symbolic gestures designed to invoke shame and obedience. The goal was to make the dissident internalize the authority of the high priests, to surrender not merely to instruction, but to the overwhelming weight of tradition itself. Through these layered disciplines, the high priests achieved what seemed impossible. They could bend the will of a person without resorting to overt physical punishment. The dissident often emerged exhausted, confused, and deeply aware of the hierarchy's reach into every aspect of thought and perception. Advisors recorded these outcomes in detail, both to perpetuate the methods and to maintain the illusion that spiritual descent could be corrected, guided, and eventually assimilated. In this way, the system self-perpetuated, a blend of ritual mastery, psychological insight, and unyielding authority that preserved not only doctrine, but the very power of the ancient Hebrew high priesthood itself. The role of scribes and advisors within the inner sanctum of the high priests was far more than ceremonial. These men were the unseen architects of the temple's secretive operations, the silent witnesses who both preserved and manipulated the record of what transpired behind the veils. While the dissident faced the calculated rigor of ritual trials and psychological pressure, the scribes meticulously documented every movement, every hesitation, every nuanced reaction. But these records were never neutral. They were instruments themselves, a tool for shaping both the present and future. In some cases, evidence of dissent was erased, altered, or obfuscated, while other moments were exaggerated to ensure that the dissidents' influence remained contained, even after they were gone. These advisors understood the profound power of perception. Within the temple, authority was as much about narrative as it was about ritual. Every detail of a ceremony could be interpreted as divine will or human judgment, depending on the framing. Scribes took advantage of this duality, selectively recording sequences to emphasize obedience or failure, ensuring that future priests could study each case as an example of the correct enforcement of hierarchy. Their ink was not merely a medium for truth, it was a lever of control, allowing the high priests to sculpt history while maintaining the illusion of sacred inevitability. Yet the burden of these roles weighed heavily. Advisors witnessed acts so extreme that even the most loyal were occasionally shaken. There were moments when dissidents, in the isolation of ritual, displayed a resilience that defied comprehension, questioning doctrines or offering interpretations that forced the scribes to pause. It was in these instances that some advisors later admitted to fear that the dissident might expose a weakness in the system or that they themselves might be implicated in the unfolding consequences of a ritual gone too far. And still, they continued. Every observation, every record, every subtle alteration was a tacit agreement. The machinery must endure, regardless of personal hesitation. In addition to documentation, Advisors played a role in designing and refining the rituals themselves. They observed responses, measured effects, and reported back to the high priests, creating an iterative system of discipline. No ritual was static. What failed to unsettle a dissident one generation became a lesson for the next. This was how the temple hierarchy remained resilient. Dissent became not just a threat, but an opportunity to perfect control. Advisors' notes, often cryptic to outsiders, contained insights into human psychology centuries ahead of modern understanding, revealing the meticulous methods used to bend minds without leaving outward scars. Even the most extreme interventions, those that seemed to surpass morality or expectation, were guided by the advisors' detailed records. They understood the subtle interplay between obedience, fear, and faith, and they manipulated these forces with a precision that bordered on clinical. They documented faint gestures, whispered prayers, eye movements, and subtle vocal inflections, all considered markers of compliance or resistance. These observations allowed the high priests to calibrate their interventions, ensuring that each dissident experienced the exact level of pressure needed to achieve the desired spiritual conformity. The scribes' work extended beyond the immediate. Some maintained secret archives inaccessible even to other priests, encoding ritual knowledge, dissent reports, and ceremonial adjustments in ciphered scrolls and symbolic annotations. These hidden records served as a safeguard against deviation, a living map of what had worked and what had failed. Through this meticulous archival practice, the temple hierarchy ensured continuity, creating a system in which dissent was not only contained but studied, measured, and refined over centuries. In effect, the advisors transformed observation into a weapon, the act of watching into a means of sustaining absolute control, leaving no room for mercy, hesitation, or rebellion. Even within the rigorously structured hierarchy of the temple, there were moments when the high priest's actions exceeded what even their closest advisors considered acceptable. These were the extreme cases, the rare occasions when discipline became spectacle and ritual transformed into psychological theater. Dissidents who displayed unexpected defiance or resilience were subjected to measures so severe that they shocked not only those who witnessed them, but the very men who had meticulously overseen countless trials before. Advisors whispered among themselves in hidden alcoves, exchanging uneasy glances, aware that the high priests had crossed thresholds that were theoretically possible, but practically unimaginable. One such case involved a young dissident whose understanding of sacred texts diverged sharply from traditional interpretation. The high priest, perceiving not just theological error, but a threat to institutional authority, orchestrated a prolonged series of tests designed to exhaust mind and body simultaneously. The dissident was moved from chamber to chamber, each one arranged to evoke different aspects of fear, awe, and obedience. Incense was layered to produce mild disorientation. Lamps were alternately bright and extinguished to unbalance the senses. Every ritual act was designed to reinforce submission, yet the dissident's persistence only intensified the priest's determination to break him completely. Advisors, though seasoned in observing control measures, found themselves unsettled. This was beyond protocol. This was experimental, almost audacious in its cruelty. The high priests utilized symbolic punishments in ways that were subtle but devastating. The dissident was forced to reenact sacred rites incorrectly, only to be corrected in elaborate, humiliating ceremonies. Each error, real or contrived, was amplified through repetition, ensuring that the individual internalized both shame and compliance. Advisors recorded every misstep, every faltering breath, and the micro-expressions of fear and defiance. Some admitted later that these moments haunted them, as they had never anticipated witnessing rituals that so thoroughly manipulated the human spirit without physical violence. The dissident's mind became the battlefield, each thought scrutinized, each gesture monitored, each expression dissected for evidence of conformity or resistance. The extreme cases also revealed the limits of human endurance. Dissidents were subjected to extended periods of sensory deprivation, ritual fasting, and isolation, often in environments where time itself seemed suspended. Whispered chants echoed unnaturally, intended to unmoor perception. Shadows flickered in patterns that provoked anxiety. Even advisors, carefully trained to observe without interference, occasionally faltered in their composure, unsettled by the psychological intensity. Yet the high priests pressed forward, knowing that the most profound lessons of obedience were only revealed when the dissident's will met the full weight of ritualized pressure. In these moments, dissent became an experiment, a demonstration of the hierarchy's capacity to enforce dominance over thought and spirit. By the end of these extreme interventions, the dissident often emerged physically intact but psychologically altered, aware of the subtle omnipotence of the temple. Advisors, meanwhile, were left to reconcile their reverence for sacred tradition with the discomfort of witnessing the edge of ritual cruelty. It was here, in these rare but critical episodes, that the high priests cemented their authority, proving that even the most devoted dissidents could be bent, reshaped, or broken entirely through carefully orchestrated ritual, isolation, and symbolic coercion. Now, I want to know, if you were witnessing such ceremonies, could you have held onto your sense of self? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts or feelings, because understanding these extreme practices is key to grasping the hidden power structures of the ancient Hebrew high priests. The next stage will reveal consequences far beyond the chamber, and the story only grows darker from here. The repercussions of these clandestine rituals extended far beyond the chambers in which they were performed. While dissidents endured psychological and symbolic punishment, the larger political and social landscape within which the high priests operated was deeply affected. These secretive measures were not merely exercises in enforcement. They functioned as strategic instruments to consolidate power, to silence alternative interpretations, and to ensure that no lineage or faction within the priesthood could challenge the Pisces established hierarchy. In effect, each dissident who endured or failed the ritualized trials became a case study in authority, a precedent reinforcing the dominance of the temple's leadership. The suppression of dissent was as much about perception as it was about obedience. Knowledge of the high priest's methods spread, even if partially, through subtle whispers and indirect accounts, creating a culture of caution and self-censorship. Priestly families learned to measure their words, their actions, their interpretations of sacred law, aware that deviation could invite scrutiny or worse. Advisors and scribes maintained detailed records, sometimes encoded to prevent the average priest from accessing the full scope of previous interventions, ensuring that the fear and respect these rituals inspired would persist across generations. Even those not directly subjected to the trials internalized the consequences, shaping behavior through observation and anticipation rather than direct experience. Political alliances within the temple were likewise influenced by the outcomes of these rituals. Families with strong connections to dissenters often found their influence waning as their members were systematically isolated or subtly discredited through the interpretive records maintained by advisors. Rival factions, observing the high priest's capacity to control and manipulate without public exposure, were reminded that loyalty alone was insufficient if coupled with even minor deviation from orthodoxy. This network of influence, intimidation, and secrecy ensured that the temple's leadership maintained a near-absolute hold over internal governance, guiding every debate, every appointment, and every ceremonial innovation according to the priorities established in the shadows. The consequences were not limited to individuals. Entire spiritual movements, teachings, and localized traditions faced obliteration if perceived as subversive. Dissidents often carried knowledge of alternative interpretations, minor doctrinal variations, or forbidden practices. When such figures were neutralized through isolation, ritual discipline, or erasure from the records, entire currents of spiritual thought disappeared. What survived were only the carefully curated teachings sanctioned by the high priests, leaving the broader population unaware of what had been lost. In this way, the control exerted in hidden chambers reshaped the trajectory of religious practice across regions and generations. Even advisors, despite their meticulous observation and participation, became complicit in the consolidation of power. Their knowledge of extreme rituals, of dissenters' trials, and of subtle coercions bound them to secrecy, ensuring the system's endurance. They understood that these processes were not solely about punishment. They were about preventing fracture, about creating a homogeneous structure of belief that served both spiritual and political ends. The dissident was not simply corrected. They were transformed into an example, their experience woven into a fabric of authority that enveloped every corner of temple governance. Through these interconnected layers, the high priest's hidden operations demonstrated a chilling principle. Control over the human spirit could be more effective and far-reaching than any overt display of power. What the public witnessed was always ceremonial, harmonious, and orderly. What occurred behind the walls was far more consequential, shaping loyalties, guiding interpretations, and silencing opposition in ways that would echo for decades. And yet, even in this intricate web of control, traces of resistance lingered. Tiny, almost imperceptible moments when dissidents' courage or intellect tested the boundaries of the hierarchy. These moments, though rare, were seeds of tension that would surface later in unpredictable ways, hinting at the complexity and fragility beneath the temple's formidable exterior. Even as the high priests enforced their authority through psychological and ritualized measures, they left behind a legacy embedded in texts, inscriptions, and symbolic artifacts that hinted at truths too dangerous to be spoken openly. Hidden within sacred scrolls were carefully veiled passages, metaphors, and coded phrases that only the most attentive or initiated could interpret. These subtle clues acted as both warning and guidance, warning for those who might defy the hierarchy, guidance for those seeking understanding of the secret dynamics that governed spiritual obedience and dissent. To the untrained eye, these passages appeared innocuous, mere theological discourse, but they were carefully layered with meaning for those who knew how to read between the lines. The scribe's hand was everywhere in this hidden communication. Texts were deliberately ambiguous, structured so that a single word could shift meaning depending on context, emphasis, or sequence. A line about ritual, purification might simultaneously describe obedience and failure, a metaphor for spiritual discipline and subtle punishment. Advisors understood the power of implication. A dissident's misstep could be memorialized without ever stating it outright, allowing future generations to internalize lessons indirectly. In this way, the priest's influence extended beyond immediate control, shaping belief and behavior across time without ever appearing coercive in the public sphere. Inscriptions in obscure chambers, overlooked altars, and forgotten storage rooms acted as physical markers of this hidden history. Crossed lines, numerically significant arrangements, and patterns in ritual artifacts signaled events, outcomes, or warnings. For example, the placement of ceremonial vessels in a seemingly arbitrary order could encode whether a dissident had succeeded in resisting the hierarchy or succumbed. Only those trained in observation and ritual symbolism could decode the message. Such subtlety ensured that knowledge of extreme measures did not spread uncontrollably. Yet the records endured, transmitting the hierarchy's lessons across generations in a way that public acknowledgement never could. These hidden signals were also used to regulate power internally. Young priests learning the subtleties of authority could discern the consequences of overstepping boundaries without witnessing extreme acts firsthand. The hierarchy's internal logic became encoded in both text and object. Obedience and attentiveness were rewarded. Deviation was cautioned against, and the shadows of past dissidents served as constant, silent reminders. In essence, the texts were a controlled archive of power, a narrative the hierarchy curated to maintain dominance without overt confrontation. Even advisors and scribes who recorded and interpreted these symbols became participants in this continuum, their observations reinforcing the authority of the high priests. Moreover, these coded passages revealed the hierarchy's perception of divine will as inseparable from control. The very act of encoding messages about dissent reflected the belief that knowledge itself was a tool for shaping the human soul. By presenting spiritual truths through ambiguity, the high priests ensured that only those who approached with humility, diligence, and reverence could fully grasp their meaning. Dissidents who glimpsed these hidden cues often did so too late or misunderstood their significance, further entrenching the hierarchy's dominance. What appeared as doctrine or tradition on the surface was, beneath, a complex system of surveillance, instruction, and subtle manipulation designed to perpetuate obedience while leaving traces for those capable of comprehension. Through these veiled texts and symbols, the high priests effectively bridged the visible and invisible realms of authority. Public rituals projected holiness and order, while secret inscriptions and coded passages maintained power over thought, belief, and memory. Dissidents faced consequences that extended beyond the immediate into a historical continuum of compliance and suppression. Each symbol, each metaphor, each subtle code contributed to a network of control that persisted long after a dissident had been removed from the chambers, ensuring the temple hierarchy remained unchallenged in both the seen and unseen worlds. The final stage of understanding the hidden world of the ancient Hebrew high priests lies not only in observing the dissidents or tracing the intricate rituals, but in grasping the enduring impact of these practices on history, spirituality, and human psychology. By manipulating obedience, fear, and the perception of divine authority, the high priests shaped an entire society's relationship with faith, hierarchy, and conformity. The extreme measures employed in secret chambers did more than control individual dissent. They transmitted a blueprint of influence that extended across generations, embedding lessons about power, submission, and ritual correctness in the very fabric of culture. Those who survived the trials, rare as they were, carried a dual legacy. On one hand, they bore the psychological marks of intense scrutiny, isolation, and symbolic punishment, a reminder of the hierarchy's absolute reach. On the other, they became silent custodians of knowledge, understanding, sometimes intuitively, how authority could bend thought without overt coercion, how obedience could be enforced with precision, and how sacred ritual could be both a vessel of devotion and an instrument of control. Even the advisors who orchestrated and recorded these experiences recognized the complexity of what had been accomplished. The high priests were not merely religious leaders, but masterful strategists of power and perception. For the wider population, the consequences were even more subtle and pervasive. Entire communities internalized the teachings and warnings encoded in ritual, text, and symbolic practice. What seemed like divine instruction was, in truth, a careful orchestration, designed to reinforce orthodoxy while erasing challenges. The dissidents' struggle, hidden from public view, became an unspoken lesson. Questioning authority carried unseen consequences, and compliance was rewarded with stability, security, and continued access to sacred knowledge. Over time, this invisible mechanism of control reinforced hierarchy, strengthened the priesthood, and ensured that dissent was rare, fleeting, or carefully contained. Yet, as history reveals, no system, however meticulous, was immune to the resilience of human curiosity and courage. The traces left behind in texts, coded passages, and obscure symbols offer glimpses into an alternative understanding, moments when dissent persisted despite extreme pressure. These fragments, preserved through secrecy, suggest that even under the weight of ritualized fear, the human spirit sought comprehension, resistance, and sometimes redemption. The legacy of these practices is thus twofold: a testament to the ingenuity of authority, and a reminder of the persistent spark of independent thought. If you've stayed with me this far, it shows a desire to understand the hidden truths that shaped not only ancient religious life, but the mechanisms of power itself. I want to invite you to take action in a way that continues our journey. Leave a comment letting me know this message was for me. If this story challenged or captivated you, give the video a like to signal that you value this exploration. And make sure you're subscribed so you can continue discovering these revelations with me. There's another video right here that complements everything we've uncovered, and I encourage you to watch it next. Delve deeper into the mysteries of ancient practices and keep exploring the shadows of history alongside me.